Hello, and welcome back to Dogs Do Speak with the amazing Colin Spence and myself, Samantha Wayland. Today we have someone who needs no introduction, and his face has been all over social media this last week because of his fabulous conference, ABK. Daniel, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yeah, and it's funny you say my face has been all over social media because one of the strange things is sort of when you're at an event like that, I don't remember taking that. Oh, yeah, did I? And it's just, yeah, so much happening. And actually, one of the amazing things that we can kind of get onto about how when so much stimulation is coming into your brain and how that affects your ability to actually remember some of those interactions. And for me, because I was not sleeping particularly well, because I don't sleep particularly well in a new place, I definitely forgot more conversations, more really interesting conversations than I should have done, which I'm really disappointed about. So hopefully people are going to prod me and remind me of things that we were talking about and planning and discussing. But yeah, my name's Daniel Shaw. I'm a behaviourist based in the southeast of England. I'm currently based in Essex, but most of our business has historically been in Kent, and also trying to do more virtual behaviour consultations now as well. My background is I have a degree in psychology and a master's degree in neuroscience, so I like to look at how we can apply behavioural science, fundamental neuroscience, into terms of how we might understand dog behaviour and how we can apply that to improve the welfare of the dogs that we are living alongside. Um, I also run an organization called the Brain and Behavior Academy, which is provides CPD for pet professionals, primarily dog behaviorists, throughout the world. And yeah, as you mentioned last a couple of weeks ago, I just ran the ABK conference, which is an event for dog professionals to kind of have the opportunity to get some CPD from some awesome professionals in our field.
That's absolutely amazing. I actually feel like the conference is still going. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend due to being in Dublin. However, everywhere I go on social media, it's still about the ABK because it's always such a good event. Today, we want to talk about fight or flight. Yeah. And we're looking at why do dogs sometimes are feeling that or getting that emotional feeling that they need to get out of here or they need to lunge at something to scare it away. Yeah. And could you sort of like give us some reasons why this could be? Why does it happen? Why do dogs feel that way emotionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps if we start off there, if we can think from an evolutionary level, why that having those defense mechanisms is so important. We know that dogs, like all animals, need to survive to be able to reproduce and pass those genes on to their offspring. So having a mechanism to respond to potential threats in the environment is really, really important. And the fight flight system, or the fight flight freeze system, or the fight fright freeze and fiddle about. Some people kind of bring in four Fs, depending on who you're talking to, and we can kind of look at the physiology of all the different responses that you might see. But that system's essentially designed to deal with things that might be threatening or threatening to cause you harm, often predators in the environment, perhaps even other members of your own species that might be threatening you to access space, resources, or food. So those kinds of threats that might be likely to cause us harm, we've got this fight flight system that gives us this way of dealing with this in terms of either fighting, using aggressive behavior as a means to get that threat away from you, or running away from that threat. And we've got obviously the kind of the at a lower level physiologically, in some regards, although it's a little bit debatable actually with the freeze system as well. But we've also got freezing, so staying very still. That often occurs before we get a fight or a flight response in many cases. And then you've got what some people call the fiddle about or fawn responses, when the animal is, looking at often appeasement behavior. Sometimes that's where you'll see displacement behaviors as well. So the dog be, using or enacting normal behaviors, but in perhaps an unusual context. And that's quite an interesting one in many ways because it's not really very well understood why dogs do that, what the function of those displacement behaviors are. So there's a lot we can sort of look at there. But I think sort of, yeah, most broadly from an evolutionary level, and then we can sort of look at it on the individual level and think about what makes an individual go into that fight flight response in a given context. And we know all these factors can play into it from a dog's genetics and what that genetic sort of repertoire that a dog comes into the world with does in terms of influencing their ability to regulate stress, influencing their ability to perceive things in the environment, how other animals, other potential threats are perceived in the environment, whether that dog is more prone to escape behaviors, whether that dog is more prone to fight behaviors or aggressive behavior, whether that dog is sort of more resilient, as we were talking about last weekend, in terms of having strategies to deal with a potential threat that might prevent things from escalating to fight or flight, or whether it's an individual that doesn't have those strategies. So, all sorts of things can be influenced on a genetic level and then also an environmental level. So, what an animal has learned, the animal's upbringing, their early developmental experience has a huge effect on their ability to regulate stress. And there's an amazing paper for looking at developmental experience that's a really, really straightforward read, I would say, as well, from 2018 by Dietz et al., which is spelt Dietz. So slightly odd spelling, if you're to sort of say out loud. But it's a really good review of kind of some of those developmental factors that can influence behavior longer term. And we know that things like the amount of time the dog spends with their biological mum has a really big impact on their ability to regulate stress and also the likelihood of dogs developing what we consider behavior problems in later life. So we know those early developmental experiences have a big impact. We know also more, well, learning experiences throughout life have a big impact, whether a dog has learnt that individuals or strangers out and about or anything in their environment is particularly threatening. And actually, I think we should perhaps come back to the topic of strangers in a little bit because I think sometimes we forget that for most animals, seeing an unknown animal that we are not familiar with is a threat to some extent. It is just how much we consider that a threat and how we deal with that potential threat. And then also that we can think about more recent factors. So actually, what is that animal's physiology looking like in the moment? How is that animal sort of, where is that animal's homeostatic balance? Is that animal really tired? Because if that animal's really tired, then that can make it more difficult for that animal to regulate their emotions. So if we've got a dog that's not slept, that's been up early, that's not been feeling well, and that's affecting their ability to sleep, and that's just one way, of course, that ill health can affect behavior. All those things could affect an animal's likelihood to sort of go into that fight flight response. And, we can think about tiredness, we can think about hunger levels. We know that hunger is really important, or food and sugar specifically, and blood glucose is really important for the function of the frontal parts of the brain, which play a really big role in regulating some of those emotional responses and helping us if we have learnt to not react in a given situation and not kind of fly off the handle when we're dealing with something that we might be struggling with, then actually the function of that frontal part of the brain is really important and making sure that frontal part of the brain has the fuel it needs in terms of blood glucose, in terms of being hydrated as well. Water is so important for brain function as well. Then all those things are going to be harder. We can also talk about social support and actually the effects of having social support, providing that social buffer, again, on emotional regulation. So all sorts of things, and in a very immediate way, in a more distal way, can have a huge impact on, I suppose, the likelihood of that fight flight response occurring.
Yeah,
Well,
that's fascinating. I think that explains why I get hangry. Then whenever I'm like, I need a snack, and I'm like, I need it right now.
Yeah, yeah. When you need a snack, you need a snack, right?
there's a whole rafter of things there that when we're looking at behaviour, there's not any one thing we should just be concentrating on. There's a lot of things we need to be looking at across the board. Yeah, the social, the environment plays a massive part, regardless. There's no two ways about that. But then what I was sort of taking from what you've just said is we have a range of dogs. We can have dogs that are confident, well-rounded, emotionally stable, etc. Still come under that category of fight, freeze, fool around, whatever. And then we have dogs that are have they're in an environment that is not the right environment for them. You then mentioned strangers, but what I'm going to throw in there is let's put the humans in there. Yeah, let's look at a dog that is already in a household or a home environment where the environment completely is the wrong type of environment. The dog has had a bad upbringing, yeah, or a bad start to life, a better way of putting it. And we see these behaviors of wanting to hold back, avoiding, yeah, giving signals, I'm really not happy about this situation. Um, where would you say, where would we start in reading, understanding, and detecting the why? Becoming that dog detective and finding out why. Where would we start?
I think for many dogs, and I had a case like this yesterday actually, I think many dogs really, really struggle with the fact in human homes there can be a huge lack of predictability over their life, um, particularly from an early stage in terms of knowing how people are going to behave around them, in terms of knowing what's going to happen in their environment, in terms of knowing what's going to happen when they go out. Are people going to approach them? Are people going to come up to them? And alongside that, really, a lack of control over being able to be given appropriate strategies to deal with that. So, for example, owners that want to touch them the whole time, or people that are, just desperate to, and this is, particularly difficult when we've got all these amazing breeds of dogs. I see a lot of cockapoos, things like this, that people find really, really cute and want to touch and want to get their hands on them. And for a dog, sort of not for those interactions being kind of sometimes sporadic, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes inconsistent in terms of what we're going to get from that human interaction. Are we going to get a conflict where you take something off me? Are we just going to be touching and playing really excitedly? Are we going to be going for kind of a lower intensity play? If we're not adding any predictability there, if we're not giving the dog any warning of what type of interaction this is going to look like, and then we're not really giving the dog any choice over whether they do engage in that type of interaction, I think that can be really, really difficult. And I think that's where understanding body language is an absolute essential first step for that, for people to be able to recognize when their dog is not comfortable with something and being able to sort of cut off a particular interaction if they start to see those signs, those early signs that a dog might not be enjoying an interaction, not the point where a dog is, lip curling, starting to really, really feel uncomfortable, a point where a dog might just not be looking like they're really enjoying a social interaction, might not be seeking out more touch interaction. I mean, those strategies with the sort of a few seconds of touch and then sort of moving, giving the dog a little bit of distance and giving them the opportunity to re-engage, I think are all really valuable for actually giving dogs more control over the interactions they're having with humans. And one issue I often see with humans over this as well, and particularly, I think this is particularly, again, this is a generalization. There's not any research on this. But just what I've seen in terms of my clients is when you have a couple and there is a man and there is a male dog, and you have to tell them that actually sometimes if the dog is looking not too comfortable and giving you those signs that not comfortable, you're going to have to move away. Often the male seems to feel like that means the dog is tougher than them or something like that in the house. And you have to kind of be like, well, look, we know that you're tougher than the dog. It's okay. You're not going to lose your girlfriend over this. It's fine. But we also don't want anyone to lose their hands. So we need to find some sort of compromise here. But I think on principle, particularly again, just from my clients, a lot of kind of male clients with partners seem to find that a real struggle. But I've had other people that find it a struggle as well. So, yeah.
So would we also look, to be quite honest with you, I hear you because I feel the same with some clients that I've met in the past and working with now. There is this male thing that they believe the dog could be stronger or end up being stronger, and it's not what the man wants. They want to be more the domineering one in that relationship. And they're not taken into consideration. And to be fair, if we don't know, we don't know. It's only when we know better can we do better. And I tend to find, just like yourself, that they're the ones that are least likely to take on board the advice that we're going to give them. In all cases, but in some cases, would we also be thinking about pain, diet, sleep?
Absolutely. Yeah. All of those things are going to be really important. We know that lots of dogs, and particularly if we're thinking about aggression in the home, and again, there's another conversation about whether we consider this part of the fight flight reflex. If we're talking about aggression in the home, where it might be something like resource guarding or touch sensitivity, it may not be that the dog is fearful in that sense. And I think um, we can differentiate the fact that a dog can be responding as if something is a threat and treating something as a threat, even if it doesn't make them fearful. If we can't find like lunch when we want to find it, it is threatening to our homeostasis and ability to regulate ourselves. Doesn't mean we're scared necessarily. We might get scared if we, 3 weeks in and we still haven't found any food, then things are getting a bit dire. But for the most part, the dog's probably not going to be scared, but it's still a threat response. It's still a threat to their ability to maintain their homeostasis and meet their core needs. So um, aggression in those contexts, I think, or aggressive behavior in those contexts, I think, yeah, is an interesting one. And yeah, absolutely. Diet, we know that many dogs that show aggressive behavior in relation to resources in particular suffer from gastrointestinal discomfort. And that's where we might have to be looking at whether the dog needs a change in diet, whether the dog needs something added to their diet to support with that gastrointestinal discomfort, whether the dog needs to be checked for any sort of gastrointestinal disease or upset that might be causing long-term effects, something that could be treatable as well. And there's all sorts of examples of that. So that being one, health, of course, being another one, as you mentioned. So I mean, gastrointestinal disease being one, musculoskeletal disease being another big one that sort of pops up as well. If dogs are feeling in pain, musculoskeletally, then it can often mean things like touch and play can become really uncomfortable. And that can tie into things like psychological trauma, because we know that often individuals that have experienced psychological trauma have developed something called allodynia, which is where light touch or touch that normally would not be perceived as painful becomes painful for that animal. So if we get a combination of an animal that's had psychological trauma and has something like musculoskeletal pain, then that combination can be really, really difficult, because then actually touch that for even that dog in previous years might have been nice or comfortable could become painful. And we have to remember that pain is something that, the whether something is painful or not is entirely decided by the brain. Pain is entirely generated in the brain. It is an assessment of our body's physical state. So if a dog's brain is saying this is painful, even though to us it may look like it should not be painful, then it's
Okay.
still painful. And we need to address that. So all sorts of ways these things can tie in. And of course, we know if a dog's had psychological trauma, then there's probably a good chance they are going to be at higher risk of developing ill health for numerous reasons as well.
That's absolutely fascinating because that really, I obviously, as you know, I work with a lot of rescues. So that just the way you've worded that explains a lot of that sort of where I'm saying your dog, the dog is giving signs of being in pain, but when it's medically examined, there's no evidence of pain there. But that makes so much sense now. What you're saying is that psychological trauma has caused that sort of neurological side. So it's the pain is there, they're feeling pain, but there's no sort of physical evidence of that. Is that yeah, that's
Yeah, and that's
absolutely.
an ongoing problem with, chronic pain particularly can often be due to sensitization of our pain pathways. Those signals that are going up to our brain being more sensitive than they were previously. I don't want to say more sensitive than they should be, because actually you could argue that this might be adaptive for the animal given the experiences that they may have had. But the pain pathways becoming more sensitive, so an animal perceives, lighter stimuli as more as painful when a typical animal might not feel those lighter stimuli as painful, and that's the difficult thing. If it's painful, as you say, if it's painful for that animal, then it's going to be something that needs addressing, even if we can't identify clinical signs of that. And there was an amazing lecture at the Hannah Capon's chronic pain symposium by I think it was Sam Lindley. I may have got the name wrong there, but really amazing lecture, sort of looking at actually, if you can think of pain as like this kind of leaky boat filling up, sometimes we can identify the cause of that. Sometimes we can identify where that leak is and cut that off. But sometimes we're not going to do that. And actually, sometimes we are in a situation where the only thing we can do is just continually empty that boat to keep the animal more comfortable and maintain their quality of life, because the leak could be in different places. And we might also be having leaks coming in from different places that are all working together to contribute to that painful experience. So I definitely recommend checking that out, and hopefully I haven't butchered that analogy too badly. So
The thing about pain, we can feel pain over a period of time. Would I also be right in saying that even if we have it checked out, get a veterinary intervention, medical intervention, can dogs still feel pain even when there is no pain? Can that association of the past still kick in when they're going to be touched? Or
yes. So I mean, I would say, if they're feeling pain, then there is pain. So I'd turn it on the head that's on its head and say, even if there is no tissue damage, and pain typically occurs in relation, and if you look at the International Society for the Study of Pain, which I think is the name of the organization I'm thinking of, but I again might have got that slightly wrong. But it's the sort of the big body you look for when we're talking about pain is, they will say that pain is this emotional experience associated with either tissue damage or the threat of tissue damage. So if, for example, I think what you're saying is, if we've got an animal that has learnt that, has perhaps had, say, a painful front end or something like that, and has learnt that having their paws touched or having their legs touched is painful. And then perhaps we've taken that animal, we've treated that pain, we've treated that injury. So we've got to the point where that the animal is in good health, and in theory, it should not be painful when we touch that. But if we've got that learnt association, and then perhaps if we've got some sensitization of those pathways as well, then that animal might still experience pain when we touch that area. And that can be a difficult thing to address. And it could be a learned thing. It could be that actually they don't experience pain, but because they're predicting that they're going to experience pain, they're still reactive to having that area touch. Or it could be that they still experience pain because we're seeing some sensitization of the pathways, and it might take some time for actually those neural pathways going from the, front legs or wherever to the brain to actually desensitize their responses to that physical contact.
that is, you explain that so much, well,
Yeah.
so much better than I ever would or ever could. Yeah. Um, so that really brings me on to then looking at when dogs actually then lose it, so to speak, because we're not listening, we're not observant enough, we're not taking it serious enough. And going back to that fight or flight, if we've got dogs living in a home setting, the flight isn't going to be very much. They've only got so much space they can maneuver into. So is that one of the reasons why we're tending to see more bites occurring within the homes? Because I'm sometimes gobsmacked of how many people I visit and the dog hasn't mauled them. We're not looking at that serious, but they have been bitten, and many members of families have been bitten because they haven't taken on board. And why should they? If you don't know, you don't know. How on earth can we address this?
Yeah, and I think, that's a difficult thing. So many dog bites do occur within the home. It's really, really common, and particularly dog bites to family members, that dog's own family members are, I think, most likely, if anything, to occur within the home. And, I think it's a huge question in terms of how we address this, I think, but,
Yeah.
obviously, I think one thing I would say is I think we often point to education as being a way to address this. And if you look at the research, education may not be the silver bullet to addressing this that we might think it may be. So, as much as, we can all talk about dog body language and how important understanding that is for being able to prevent dog bites within the home, prevent people from, pushing things too far with their dog. A lot of people have a lot of biases with their own dog and in their own situation that can, I think, prevent some of these things taking effect. So, for example, we know that people often just don't think that this stuff applies to their own individual dog. They can take on that education, but they can say, oh, yeah, it doesn't matter with my dog because my dog loves me and I'm fine.
Mhm.
And they don't recognize that that risk, however much your dog loves you, however close of a relationship you have with your dog, things can still go wrong potentially. And we often, I'm sure you both see this as well. We often hear about bites and incidents where it came out of the blue and the dog had never behaved like this before. And, it's a totally new thing. And, maybe that something changed for the dog. Often it's a health thing that's changed for the dog that means the dog's feeling very differently about things because they're not feeling well. So I think education is important. And I think the more we can get, particularly kids aware of dog body language, parents aware of being able to prevent their kids getting to their dogs and being around with their dogs unsupervised. And we sort of engineer and help kids interact with dogs in appropriate ways, all really important. But I also think we need to think more broadly about social change,
Mhm.
things that we can get people to do without necessarily having to give them as much education on dogs as well. So we know, for example, that the type of post box you have hugely influences the likelihood of the postal delivery worker being bitten. Whether you have a post box by your front gate, whether you have one at the bottom of your door, that's not a good one to have, really. I wouldn't fancy being the the person to have to post that through a load of people's doors. We know that even legislation around dogs and culture around dogs, whether people are, whether it's the norm to kind of um, have baby gates and things like that in the home. I'm not a huge fan of the use of crates for dogs because in most cases, because I do think often dogs that are kept in a crate a lot show a lot of rebound behaviors when they come out of that crate that can then be
Yeah.
problematic. And I have quite a few clients in the US that have their dogs in crates so often that the dog can't be trusted at all in the home. And I think the downside of that is, I think one of the lovely things about having a dog is being able to have them be a part of your home and know that they're not going to pull over all your furniture and unplug all your wires and all those sorts of things. But if your dog is pretty much always in a crate when they're in the home, then you're going to get more rebound behavior. You're going to get more behavior that we consider kind of troublesome because the dog's suddenly looking for stimulation when they get out of that crate. But I think having tools to manage the dog and kind of having it the norm to now have the dog in separate spaces when we're doing certain things, making it the norm in terms of how visitors interact with the dog are all going to be really, really valuable. But yeah, I think thinking a little bit beyond education as well with that, I think thinking actually what can we do to nudge people's behavior in such a way that it just makes them a little bit safer around dogs is also going to be key.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. My take on this is that I believe man, we take dogs for granted. The world has become smaller and smaller, and in, I don't know, next 10, 15, 20 years, it'll be smaller still. So I think it's going to get worse before it even thinks about becoming better, to be quite honest. Um, I understand you've had some rescue experiences. Um,
Yes.
uh, how do we look at the rescue behaviours compared to, when I say rescues, we have the dog that may be in a rescue centre, if that's the way we want to call it, or the rescue coming into the home. How do their behaviours sometimes differ from the norm, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not a huge rescue person in by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm sure there are many people that are sort of better qualified to speak about this than I am. But yes, I do a small amount of work with the rescue with Samantha as well in Spirit of the Dog in Essex. And I mean, I think broadly, which is, by the way, a foster-based rescue as well. So that's kind of something to consider when we're obviously thinking about rescue and the types of experiences a dog is going to have there in terms of whether they're going into kennels, whether they're going into a foster home before they are then placed in a home, and sort of that what that transition looks like and what that allows as well in terms of assessment of the dog's behavior and how we assess that dog behavior safely for getting that dog into the foster home. Um, yeah, I think that the biggest thing I'd say about rescue dog is rescue dogs are dogs and they are like any other dog. They have often had some they're often a little bit older, I suppose, firstly, and they often have had some change in ownership. And we know that change in caregiver can affect the way some dogs process their environment. We know that changing caregivers, for example, is associated with an increased likelihood of separation concerns. And again, that's an interesting one because that I think came from a correlative study. So we don't know whether the change in ownership caused the separation concerns, or whether actually just dogs that had separation concerns are more likely to be relinquished, because we know actually a lot of people really struggle to live with dogs with separation concerns. So, I mean, I think broadly when we're thinking about working with rescue dogs, I think we've just got to go in with the same attitude that we would with any dog in that dog is an individual. Being a rescue dog doesn't mean that there's anything different about that dog. Doesn't mean that that dog's got gonna be more at risk of biting inherently. We've just got to assess that dog as an individual, and make sure, of course, we are doing a really careful and appropriate risk assessment. Make sure we're gathering as much information from everyone who has been involved in that dog's life that we can access, whether that's the previous caregiver, whether that's the people that have picked that dog up and looked after it for a few days while finding him a rescue space, whether that's, kennel staff, if you are in a kennel-based rescue, whether that is a foster carer as well, whether that's the person that was transporting the dog from somewhere to another place. So there's often people, even if the dog's microchipped, what's that dog's experience at the vets beforehand? Just at the seminar we were doing after the ABK conference with Trish McMillan and Tom Candy, Trish was talking about how actually we see a lot of people that will drop off dogs, or certainly in the US this is, but I assume it probably does apply to the UK as well. Um, that maybe won't be the most honest about where that dog's come from and what that dog's background is. And, just asking them to give you some information and asking them to say, oh, no, how was this dog with you? Has this dog tried to bite you at all? Has this dog showed any aggressive behavior, without kind of trying to call them out or accuse them, can still be really valuable, because these people may have really important information that they can provide you with. And, I think also I would say then, if you are given some information that might be a warning sign, making sure you're following up on it and making sure that wherever that dog does go, we've got people in place that are trained and able to deal and manage with that behavior appropriately. I don't not necessarily deal with that behavior or resolve that behavior, but know how to manage that behavior appropriately in a way that's going to minimize stress for the dog. Because I have also seen cases where that has been ignored, or there have been warning signs that have been ignored, and rescues have been subject to legal action because they've, for example, had a history form where it's been flagged that the dog is a little bit funny about certain resources, and then there's been some incidents between transporting the dog to a foster home, and then there's been an incident where the foster carers maybe weren't particularly trained in how to do that, and then the dog has bitten someone. So I think it's really, really important to, if we're getting those warning signs, to thoroughly make sure we are taking that on board, responding to that, and being really mindful of that information before we place that dog with any foster carers. And if we have got warning signs, particularly about aggressive behaviour, then you're going to need very experienced foster carers, because essentially you are often dealing with a dog where we have got that limited history. So we're going to need someone who has got that experience to be able to read that dog's body language, to be able to react appropriately if something does go wrong.
Do you think that the homes that they're going back to sort of what you were saying earlier, but then bringing the rescue dogs into it, do you think the homes that are taking on rescue dogs are almost more considerate and they put more management in place to work with those dogs than, say, people who get a puppy? So a lot of people will come to me and they're like, well, we got a puppy because it's a blank slate, and they sort of come at it from that side, not thinking of obviously everything beforehand. Do you see more almost consideration for the dog when it's a rescue than it's a puppy? Or
Well, for me, if I'm getting a rescue dog, it's because I'm thinking I don't want to have to be taking the dog out every 5 minutes and having my hand chewed up. So I'm thinking less management, great. But yeah, I think perhaps on I think yeah, it's true that like people, and going to depend also on the adoption criteria for the rescue in terms of who they would consider. But yeah, I think generally you're going to get people that are more prepared and a little bit more. Um, we often see, particularly, new puppy owners that have never had a dog before, and even some experienced puppy owners can be problematic in some senses as well, because they've had a gazillion dogs before and they're going to do things exactly the same way, and sometimes they aren't able to respond and adapt to that individual puppy's needs, can sometimes be difficult. So I think, yeah, sometimes the homes you'll get, if you are getting a good home for a rescue dog, can be really amazing in terms of the management and the understanding that that home brings. But obviously, those homes are hard to find sometimes as well.
Totally. Finding a home, a good home for a rescue is difficult. And a lot of the homes I go into, it's the odd one. Every so often you go, wow, this is amazing. Everything's worked out. Dog has found the right peoples, the peoples have found the right dog. But in the main, I do tend to find that they're not compatible, or the dog's not. It's a difficult one. It really is difficult. Daniel, you have been absolutely amazing. Yeah. Um, I found it hard. I normally make notes and stuff, but every time I went to make a note, you would say something. I had to put the pen
well, I've done the
down.
same as I did at the conference, and I've just written down people that I need to look up.
You are an amazing person, and anyone that, if this is your first time seeing Daniel, please go follow him, because you're going to learn loads. Yeah, you will learn a lot, especially if you want to go into the behaviour side of things. Bags of knowledge. Daniel, thanks for coming on to Dogs Do Speak. It's been absolutely amazing having you on. I don't think it stops there. I'm pretty sure Samantha and I are going to ask you to come back at some point in the future. Yeah, the very near future. And so, everyone, please hit that subscribe button. Please hit the like so you don't get to miss any of the content that we put out. It's going to be a goodbye from myself and Samantha. And Daniel will most definitely be back very soon. Bye for now.